Thank you. I don't know if I have the advantage of being the last speaker before lunch or the disadvantage, but regardless, I'm going to try to keep this brief. This has been a collaborative PowerPoint. Barbara Crane, who's our regional geneticist, couldn't be here today, so she asked me to step in and do this, so I hope I can convey the information that Barb wanted me to put out here. We're looking at shortleaf pine, the genetic resources within the Forest Service, and supporting reforestation and restoration in the southern region. These are just some of the talking points we're going to be looking at. First wide, let's hit on some of the Southwide Shortleaf Genetic Resource Survey. Excuse me. This was a survey that Barbara developed that she sent out to land managers and Forest Service and so forth to just look at some of the information that we need to gather to learn what we need to do as far as shortleaf. Looking here at our little projector here on shortleaf, shortleaf has one of the largest range of the 4 major commercial southern pines across 22 to 24 states. It is a fire adapted in the ecosystem with that typical stem crook that I know all of you are familiar with, which would allow it to resprout after fire. Cone crops every 5 to 7 years, a seed shelf life of 15 years with proper desiccation. Now, as an orchard manager, I can tell you that looking at cone crops, as our orchards have aged, that has changed. We're getting actually cone crops within the orchards looking now every 8 to 10 years. And those are going at marginal, maybe to a bumper crop. The last bumper crop that we had in the orchard was in 2009. And we've not had significant crops since 2009. Shortleaf is, of course, an imperiled ecosystem. 50% of that which has been lost over the last 40 years, majority of which due to pine beetle outbreaks, the lack of fire, changes in forest management practices, and changes in land use. And somebody mentioned the loblolly component earlier, which Forest Service is guilty of doing the same thing. We all jumped on the loblolly bandwagon and trying to put timber production ahead of anything else, which leads to another issue of hybridization, which appears to be on the increase, where these shortleaf and loblolly components are now found together. Looking at our restoration plan was written by the Forest Service, and its current vision is being updated by the Forest Service and our partners. And then we're going to look at our efforts at increased restoration, both artificial and natural regeneration, which currently right now within the Forest Service we're standing at about 50-50, 50 artificial, 50 natural regeneration. Looking at our forest inventory and analysis and the decline of shortleaf over the last, 32 years. In 1980, you can see where the range of shortleaf across the southeast, and of course, as was mentioned several times before, Arkansas is the predominant shortleaf. That's just shortleaf country. But look at the changes east of the Mississippi, and the majority of this has been because of land management practices and southern pine beetle. I know for those of us in North Carolina, southern pine beetle several years ago was a tremendous detriment to our shortleaf resources. Now this, as I mentioned earlier, the shortleaf survey that Barbara initiated and circulated this in 2012 and 2015. And this is going to be posted, is my understanding, on the initiative website. This was looking at orchard resources, current orchard management practices, seed inventories, and the program intentions for the next 5 years. And the idea was to assess the shortleaf resources that were available so that we could meet the current and the projected demand for genetically improved seed. And what did we learn as a result of that initial surveys? Well, state agencies own roughly 9% of orchard resources. Oklahoma Department of Forestry, we didn't get a response back from that. Tennessee Division of Forestry has 9 acres devoted to shortleaf orchards. Arkansas Department of Forestry, 14 acres. Kentucky Department of Forestry, 15. Georgia Forestry Commission, 4 acres. North Carolina Forest Service, 18 acres. which leaves the Forest Service owns and manages 91% of all shortleaf resources within the region. That's a little daunting, if you ask me. I mean, it's, you know, when you look at the condition and you look at the state of what the shortleaf ecosystem has become, that's pretty intimidating. Industry has none. Plum Creek, Weyerhaeuser, Louisiana Forestry Seed Company, and Southern Seed Company deal only with seed. And those folks have contacted me trying to buy seed. The picture here, I just want to show you how beautiful this is. This is a second generation shortleaf seed orchard on the Ouachita. Now, step back our talking points again. Now we've got some of this information. What are we going to look at? The state of the Forest Service shortleaf genetic resources. Look at our seed banks, our seed orchards, progeny tests, seed production areas. And this is what we have currently. Forest Service genetic resources, we have roughly 500 acres in first generation seed orchards devoted to shortleaf. Those were planted and they were grafted orchards. They're planted in the mid to late 60s. 27 acres dedicated to second generation planted in the 1990s, and I will add another 5 acres to that we established at Beech Creek in 2013. We don't have anything in third generation at this point and nothing dedicated to strictly a seed production area. But what we're doing is resurrecting some of those progeny tests that we have and looking at those at potential seed production areas across the range of where those progeny tests were planted. This is just kind of a map showing you where the seed orchards are located. Beech Creek, looking up at the southern Appalachians, Beech Creek and Chilhowie are right together, and I want to add that Beech Creek is in western North Carolina and the Chilhowie is in eastern Tennessee. Currently we don't have anything but white pine and red oak and white oak planted at Chilhowie, but the intention is to move some of that second generation shortleaf to the Chilhowie site. It'll probably be beyond my career, but that's the plan at this point. We're looking at Mississippi, which is the Rambert, and in Louisiana, the Stewart Seed Orchard, and of course the Ouachita on the Mount Ida. Now, when we're looking at our progeny tests, the Forest Service established 155 shortleaf progeny tests between 1982 and 1993. Those surviving tests are being evaluated at this point, resurrected, documented, monumented, and silvicultural prescriptions are being written to turn some of those that are acceptable into seed production areas. Hopefully some of the data will be collected for the Appalachian seed zones and those Appalachian sources in FY17, and of course that's going to be funding dependent. As far as our shortleaf seed inventory, 4,500 pounds roughly is in storage now, 90% of which is Arkansas source, collected between 1984 and 2014. And Barb's put this for my benefit in big red letters, need Appalachian seed. Well, yeah, we absolutely do. And I'm faced with the dilemma at Beech Creek that the resources we have on the orchard are becoming so old that our seed production has declined. Southern pine beetle hit us pretty hard several years ago. John Blanton was my silviculturist on the forest at that time, and John remembers when we got hammered pretty hard with southern pine beetle, in the orchard especially, and it was just devastating. We need that Appalachian seed source, and what we may resort to is if we cannot get our second generation coming on, and if we cannot ramp up seed production in our first generation, we may have to go back into doing wild collections within those seed zones and within those areas on the National Forest. All right, currently this is what we're doing in North Carolina, particularly at Beech Creek. We're working with the North Carolina Forest Service, ramping up and building up our second generation orchards to look for the future, looking at seed production. We're using existing progeny test data, and then the state of North Carolina took all of our old progeny test data, went back in, selected those sites, remeasured some of those, and then jointly we went in together, collected sign material, grafted those onto rootstock, and we've established those at Beech Creek. And I've got here anyone else interested, because this is what we've done right now in North Carolina, but it also needs to be done in the other areas where we have test sites and throughout the range of shortleaf. Tennessee, Georgia, there's a few in South Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia. These need to be done in the same areas also. So if anyone else is interested in this kind of work, we desperately need that help. All right, step back again, looking at our restoration and reforestation activities. For those of you that are aware of anything in the Southern Appalachians, natural regeneration of shortleaf in the Southern Appalachians through the mountain range is a little difficult. If we don't have good clear ground, if we don't have a good burn so that we can have clear area for seed to drop, we don't get very good natural regeneration. So the majority of ours is artificial regeneration. So one of the things we have to do is start with a critical question. What's the most appropriate genetic material to plant that will grow a healthy, diverse, and sustainable forest with 50 to 100-year rotations? Well, of course, it's going to have to be one that's most adaptable, competitive, and cover a greater range. And shortleaf appears to be one of those species, because shortleaf is a resilient species and is also a generalist species. It's resilient in the fact that it is adaptable to a greater range. It is more resilient because it is cooperative with fire. It actually thrives with a good fire regime. It is a generalist, and that it will cover the largest range of all the southern pines, and it survives well, and it's important for us to take these into consideration and keep our orchards and our genetic material in our progeny tests healthy and diverse. So one of the things that we have to do to look at this and where we go from here is to look at our seed zones, because our seed zone guidelines and where we can move material from one place to the other. And that has been based on Dr. Ron Smidling's work over the last 50 years with past and current genetic information. And it's based on what we see now, that this is going to be pertinent to how we can move seed from one area to another, how we can restore and where we can use shortleaf resources. And under the threat of climate change, so looking at these and the existing seed zones, it's pretty obvious that it's time for an update because one of the issues that comes about, of course, from this is climate change. And a lot of people there's a little controversy always about climate change, and some people say, well, yes it is, no it's not. I think if you look at simply the mean departure in temperature over the last 1,000 years, you can't deny the fact that there are issues of climate change. When you look at the Industrial Revolution from the late 1800s just through 2002, I don't know how well you can see out here on the very end, but this peak from the late 1800s to 2002 is just simply a departure in mean temperature. All right, and if you can see our seed zones, it's obvious that our seed zones are changing. The 1990 map down on the bottom and the 2006, it's a little bit difficult to see, and even with a pointer, I'm not sure if you can make it out. But if you look at where zones 6 and 7 merge together, especially through that band through the middle of the southeast, at how that has changed, particularly in the Southern Appalachians. So what should we do to modify or operationally prepare our forests to be resilient? We're going to have to do some modification on seed zones. Where can we plant and where can we use seed that we already have? And some of those guidelines are in our genetic options for adapting national forests to climate change. This is a publication in 2012. And this is outlining some of the changes that we need to look at. And all of those are the changes in our seed zones and what we intend to do to move seed north and south, east and west, and also taking into consideration elevation. All right, so what we want to be doing is planting in the right areas for now and for the future. So we need to look at new seed zone development and application. And one of the things that we'll be doing for that is mixing seed lots from adjacent north and south seed zones, planting those in a northern seed zone. For example, mixing zones 7 and 8 and plant them in zone 8. Then through natural selection and breeding, they'll become adaptable to be planted into Zone 7. Okay, seed forecasting. Is there enough seed currently to do some of the things that we initially planned to do? No, there's not. We currently don't even have enough seed to meet the 5-year demand that our forests are looking at for what they desire for shortleaf. Taking this into consideration, we must understand physiology and the seed biology. Gene ecology studies to understand adaptation, and assistance in migration studies, which will look at north and south, east and west, and elevation changes and where we can apply shortleaf seedlings. All right, I'm just going to briefly touch on the shortleaf and loblolly hybridization. This is something that we've done at Beech Creek. I know that that'll be addressed later on this afternoon. The issue came about and the question came about as to whether or not our progeny tests were actually 100% shortleaf, or if we may have some instances of hybridization within our progeny tests. Personally, I don't think so. We don't have any loblolly around the Beech Creek area. But then it came into question, well, what about in the 1960s when that original sign material was collected in the forest? Could that have been hybridized at that time? And could there be some genetic component of loblolly in the existing orchard material? So one of the things that we've done this year is all of the shortleaf sources within the Forest Service now have been DNA fingerprinted. That is through the NEFGEL lab in Placerville, California. And when we get that information back, we'll look and see if there are anything in the orchard that needs to be removed as far as hybridization. And they continue around some of the other orchards. I don't have an issue, thank goodness, at Beech Creek, but removing the loblolly from existing orchards so that we don't get that hybridization in future seed crops. All right, now finally, our current and future strategies and looking at our partnerships. And this is a current strategy. This is a seed projection need based on a 5-year cycle for reforestation needs. Silviculturists and managers look at this and turn this in based on a 5-year desire. For example, we've taken the Cherokee, and I know Bob's familiar with this, looking at shortleaf over projected acres to plant per year, say for example 800 acres per year. The number of seedlings that they'll need is 480,000. Seed per pound on shortleaf is roughly 41,300, which means they're going to need about 12 pounds of seed per year to meet that demand. And 12 pounds of seed per year doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that in the collection process in the orchard, I may get a half a pound, sometimes as less as a third a pound of seed per bushel of cones. So, you know, that demand for seed is increasing, and trying to ramp that up is a management nightmare for me at this point. All right, our future strategies, working with Eastern Forest Environmental Threat Assessment Center, FTAC, to develop those new tree range maps and the forecasts. Region 8 will be using these for seedling deployment, and Region 8 will be mixing those seed sources in the new planting zones. Longleaf and shortleaf, we're going to be taking risks in smaller areas for plantations, determining the suitable locations for seed transfer under climate change. All right, and looking at some of our partners, Forest Service Research and Development, the National Forest Genetics Lab in Placerville. This is where we're doing our DNA fingerprinting on the sources we have in the orchard. And of course, FTAC, the Eastern Forest Environmental Assessment Center, the National Tree Seed Lab in Macon, Georgia, and National Center for Genetic Resource Preservation. This is in Fort Collins, Colorado. This is where we store all of our genetic material and a sample of all of our genetic material. So some challenges still exist. A lot of challenges still exist. I think that maybe that's the way the slide should read, is limited resources, of course, people and funding. Now, speaking from an orchard manager's standpoint, at one point when I began working at the orchard 30 years ago, we had enough people. We had a manager, an assistant manager, 2 equipment operators, 2 technicians, and a crew of folks. We had roughly 15 to 18 people on the orchard all the time, and that was for 1 seed orchard. There's myself and 1 other gentleman now that operate 2 seed orchards. And of course, we can do some things through contract, but that's just not enough warm bodies to do the work that needs to be done. And of course, that comes into play with scarcity of seed for those southern Appalachian areas. Beech Creek is a grafted seed orchard, and those shortleaf sources in the orchard were dating back to 1965 to 1968. And when you look at the sign material that those trees were originally taken from, that sign material may have been 90 years old when it was collected. So if it was 90-year-old sign material and grafted in 1960, you know, it's beyond its seed production age.